Mound, but I think there was something to do with the Civil War too. And I just became obsessed. I felt like there was this presence of many souls and people in this place, and it was completely empty. And so that really brought me on a journey to coming back, because as I started to do research, I discovered that this was where, as people were fleeing slavery from the Delta, this is where they would be in the camps, the contraband camps. This is where people were after the Civil Wars, where people took refuge during the Yellow Fever. It's an incredibly important place, and if you go there, you can't tell any of that. And I think, in order to understand where we are today, we do have to get back to where we started and see what that roadmap is. So in terms of imagining that better Memphis, I think it's really looking at how we can empower people. When we look at why we look at history, I would say there's three things. One is that the way history looks at history is not just only facts and figures, right? I mean, we've all had the class in school where we just crammed for the test and we had the names of the kings and the dates, and as soon as we left the test, we forgot about it. But it's, what are the questions? What's the framework? And we look at case studies as a way to look at the fragility of democracy. So when we look at the Holocaust, how does a democracy become state-sanctioned mass murder? When we look at the Reconstruction era, which is so relevant to Memphis here today, it's a nation divided, and how do we come back together? What does justice look like? And then the questions and tools that we get out of that. The questioning for me of going to that place for Pickering and asking them, how come I don't know about this? I mean, it's that habit of those questions that then become a toolbox for us as we start to evaluate our current situation. So it's not to make facile comparisons to history, but it's the practice of those questions. The second thing is, again, kind of the roadmap to where we are today. If we look at the racial disparities we have to understand how we got to them, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later. But the third is really the hope that we have to have, and the examples of justice in the past. Justice has happened in the past in both small and large ways, and we call those people upstanders, where they were individuals or groups. And I think those are the inspirations that we can have to help us think about that.
Can you hear me? Is this on?
Is it turned?
Hello? So this is actually something that I had to confront earlier. I was asked to do a similar kind of, well, it was almost like a panel, but it was a TED Talk. So each of us, there was a national conference in town for Strive, which does cradle-to-career work, and our local implementation of that is Seeding Success. You've heard of that organization, which does great work looking at data and how you actually use the data to make decisions and implement programs, and then assess and hold those programs accountable. But the national conference was in town, and so they asked a group of us, Andrea Robinson, who's a professor at Rhodes College, Wendy Thomas, and then a young lady who works at Bridges, to kind of talk about this. What does an equitable Memphis look like? And so each of us had a certain portion. One person took, Andrea as a professor, took the history, what was Memphis, what did Memphis look like. Wendy took kind of what's the current and what does Memphis look like. My job was to take the future. And so I looked at it many different ways and tried to think about what would it look like, and challenge myself not to think, well, how do we get there, or not get stuck in how do we get there, but really, what does that look like? So I thought we might get this question. So I brought those pieces, and the tool that I used that really broke down the barrier of me thinking about that was something I use when I'm facilitating groups sometimes, which is doing headlines. And so one of the ways that you think about the future is, well, what does it look like in the future, and just giving it a basis and a headline. So I'll read, if I can, these few headlines to you and give you an idea of what I think equitable Memphis looks like. And then I started off actually with a quote from Martin Luther King, as we start off many things as we talk about race, but we don't think about him as much as we should in terms of economic justice. And not just kind of civil rights. But he once said, the Negro population, then it seems to be that Negroes should, oh, this is cut off. I'm sorry. Basically, what he said in the quote, because it's not here specifically, is that if there was a community that was 30% African American, then it would make sense that the jobs in that community would also be taken by 30%. Not just the menial jobs, but the jobs across the board. And that's a problem that we see here now. So in looking at education, which is where we started the focus, the headline reads, over 30,000 more African American students are proficient and advanced in reading and language arts. So that's what it would take for African Americans to close the gap to our white students in education. 15,000 fewer black students get suspended. So that's the suspension gap that we have. So then as you think about it and you start to move to an equitable education system, then you start to think about how does that impact and how does that build a better economic and more just economic system. And so that leads us to business. Black business receipts account for 64% of total receipts. So that would be 64% of the population, 64% of total receipts. Whereas right now, African American receipts account for less than 1% of total receipts. Blacks in managerial jobs in Memphis increased 40% to full representation. So that means that in managerial jobs, African Americans are about 20% as you look across the city. And so you'd have to increase that by 40% to get to actual representation. And then we move to, if we focus on education, we got into the economics, then African Americans and other people value African American culture and culture of African Americans and Latinos, and so you start to see more investment and donations made to our cultural and art scene. So what does that mean? Hattie Lou Theater and Collage Dance Collective surpassed attendance rates of all performing arts groups. So in a city that's majority African American, our largest and most established organizations, Hattie Lou Theater and Collage Dance Collective, would be showing attendance rates that rival any of our operas or symphony or playhouse. What does that mean for giving? Arts Memphis increases grant awards to Hattie Lou and Collage 3,000% as vital core arts organizations. So for them to meet the range of where some of our more established arts organizations are in giving, they'd have to increase by 3,000%. And so as you also see more representation in all of these fields, you start to see it in the civic environment. So boards of major organizations expand black representation 40% to match city demographics. So as we looked at just 3 examples, United Way, Arts Memphis, the Crime Commission, Operation Safe Community, their African Americans are between 14% to 20% of those boards, if you look at those. So how do we expand those? So that was kind of the encapsulation of what it is to get to Memphis opportunity, representation, and equity. And then from a personal note, so that's just kind of broad and systemically, and I'd say, because I see my friend Larry Tague out there, I'd say from a personal note, what a Just Memphis looks like is creating and building opportunity. Larry Tague gave me my first job while I was in high school. It just kind of popped into my head. And he gave it to me without having ever seen me, met me in person. It was just the beginning of the internet days, and I emailed Larry and said, hey, I'm coming back to Memphis. I was away in high school. I need an internship, I need a job. And sight unseen, based on our emailing and talking to each other over email and him seeing what I was able to do, he gave me a position. And the first time I met him face to face was when I walked into the University of Tennessee building. And so that's what opportunity looks like. It looks like building and broadening out opportunity for all so that we see that impacting us in all various areas of our community.
I am strangely and without any real explanation filled with hope, and I'm delighted to be here. Professor Gill, thank you so much for the invitation. It's particularly an honor to be up here with Marty and Cardell. In the last 2 years, our professional lives have started to cross paths a number of times, and it's a wonderful thing to be plucked out of the criminal justice system and to be asked to imagine a more just city. If anyone gets us confused, I'm the one with the beady eyes and the kind of shifty look. To imagine a more just city. I could imagine a criminal justice system that's increasingly getting smaller, that this community begins to lead the nation in right-sizing our criminal justice system, in the last 40 years, it has expanded at a level unprecedented in the history of the world. We now incarcerate more people than any country, anywhere else in the world. We incarcerate, it's off the charts. To imagine a more just city, the more, I'm so excited about the investment and the innovation and the experimentation that's underway within our public school system and what that could mean in the future. Marty, I was at Facing History last year and I heard Bryan Stevenson speak, and I hope some of you were there. I think he's the most important voice in the country right now on issues of justice and race and redemption and hope. I know there are deep, deep, deep pockets of poverty in our community, and I know that those pockets of poverty are where people are so unbelievably unsafe in this community. But I am feeling this incredible sense of hope right now in this city, this collision of a city, this collision of race and religion and wealth and poverty and food and music and all of the things that makes Memphis so unique. We have a long history. A radical idea of fairness took hold here almost 100 years ago that gave rise to something that wasn't known anywhere else. And that was this idea that if you were looking at losing your liberty, that process would not be fair unless you had a lawyer. You may not know that the early seeds of what has become public defense were planted here in Memphis almost 100 years ago. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. What's so exciting about being up here with you guys is that we're no longer talking about just criminal justice or just education or drawing on our history. We're starting to connect the dots all the way from what it takes for future workforce development and tracking it all the way back to the importance of what happens from the point of conception through the first 36 months. These are all the pieces. And if we can, with hope, move forward, I think we can imagine a more just city.
So, one thing that's, I think, common from the three comments so far is and probably something that we sense and know as being Memphians, is that there's a level of isolation that exists in our community. We are able to wall ourselves off and live in our own isolated world. And that is as true for me as it is true for someone who's in a totally separate isolated world that doesn't come over to Temple very often, or this part of town very often. And so one of the challenges that I recognize, and I guess I'll put this to you, and maybe I'll start with you, Marty, and maybe we'll just create dialogue from there. It's often hard to even begin the process of reconciling or having any sort of reconciliation across those perceived boundaries, those perceived barriers or differences between us. And I ask, picking on you, because Facing History has such an incredible framework for creating the space to have these conversations, but those are happening in not just in classrooms, but largely in classrooms. If we were to imagine that community-wide, what are the kinds of ways in which you create a dialogue across an isolated, sort of separated community that doesn't have a tremendous amount of trust in itself?
That's a great question. And that is what we strive to do in classes and in community, and it's difficult. And I think one of the challenges that I would like all of us to tackle, and I don't think it's one that I can figure out yet, but is how you get people to the table who don't really see a need to have a conversation. So I think what can happen if you have people that are willing to be a little uncomfortable or go into a situation where we can have a conversation, then where we would come in is to give some tools to help have that in a safe way. Just to really be specific, in a Facing History context, we contract. We start every conversation with really what do we all need from each other to be able to have a conversation that's honest, and we know that there can be some ouch moments, but we're going to do this with respect, and we're going to listen to learn, not listen just so that we can think about what our answer is going to be. So we, very deliberate about that. I think we're also really looking at stories of individuals. You know, I think that one of the power of our curriculum is that we really get to walk in someone else's shoes. And you know, we do that in our lives, whether it's in film or in a novel or in a class, where you have the opportunity to really understand where someone else is coming from, and that requires empathy. And so it's really figuring out how do we allow and give people that development of empathy. If we don't have empathy, then I don't think that we can really get to that next level. And so, I mean, I think those are some of the things that I would really, you know, call for. I think, you know, we do have something to be really proud of, and that is, I think we have an incredibly strong interfaith community here in Memphis. I've been really struck by that as I've come back and seeing people from, you know, leaders and others from all the different religions coming together to start to have the dialogue. But again, I think it's, you know, how do we get people who aren't necessarily interested in you know, coming to the table. And so for those of us who are willing, I think it's, we have to be uncomfortable. We have to kind of put ourselves out there. We might need to you know, deliberately think about a situation where we can have some kind of a meaningful experience with someone that we wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to. But before we go there, we might want to get some tools. We have actually just could have come out with a guideline called Fostering Civil Dialogues. So there's ways that we can educate ourselves about how to just think about how we might interact with people, which is really, you know, sometimes it's just about asking a question. And I just would end with one little story about a student who is Muslim, and was, you know, she would describe herself as your typical teenage girl. She grew up in Dyersburg, very, you know, strong in her faith, but comfortable, and never felt really threatened until, you know, the last months and year with not only the rise of terrorism and feeling the danger of, you know, being also someone who could be targeted by terrorists, but the rhetoric that happened around, you know, what might happen, what we might need to do with Muslims. And so she started thinking about what she knew about history and how that, you know, is that going to happen to me? Is my family going to be taken to a camp? Are my parents going to be deported? But instead of just sitting in that fear and being alone, she reached out to some of her friends in her Facing History class and took a deep breath and was willing to admit that fear. And, you know, she was met with great love and acceptance. And then I think what is really important is that she allowed people to be vulnerable, to say, you know, I don't really understand Islam, can you explain it to me? And, you know, maybe ask a question that they thought was stupid, you know, because they're like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And that created that space where they could learn from each other. And I think, you know, that's really brave, and I think those are the moments that we need to draw from.
Part of what I was just going to say, you identified some really specific gaps that exist in our community. Actually, what are the barriers beyond not talking about it that prevent those gaps from being addressed to the extent that lead to the kinds of headlines that you identified?
I mean, I think that part of it, that gap is the not talking about. Like, I don't know if we can say besides not talking about it, because the not talking about it is kind of the thing. Like, so until we name it and claim it and say that's what it is and that's where it's happening, I think a lot of times here, I'm sure across the country, but especially here where we have a big city, kind of small town, people know each other, then it becomes, and people are in charge of institutions and organizations and businesses, and they have practices that don't reflect what we say we want in our community, but we are not as aggressive or as assertive or as determined as we could be at saying, well, that is a problem. And if somebody points it out, it becomes, well, yeah, that problem exists, but that person isn't like that, because we think about it very individually because we have these personal relationships, instead of thinking of it systemically and structurally in terms of that person might not be bad, and we're not saying that person is bad, but that person is facilitating an institution that is coming out with an outcome that is not what we say we want. And we have to get past kind of the conversation. One of the immediate things, examples that comes to mind, is thinking of Henry Brooks. And so when Henry Brooks was on the county commission, even before when she was a state rep, you know, Mr. Bush, she might not say everything in the nicest way that you wanted to say it. She came out and said, hey, she pointed at juvenile court and said, it's being run like a plantation. And that turned some people off, understandably. But the facts of the matter were proved out after she went to DC and talked to the Justice Department. They came in and they looked at juvenile court and they said, this is not being run the way that it should be run. This is impacting, in large part, African American kids in a disparate way than it's impacting white kids in our community. And if that's not what we want, then we have to be willing to say, yes, that is not the outcome that we want. And yes, you know, Judge Turner, magistrates, or other people who came after him, even if we know them, that that's not what we want. And we have to be willing to say and stand up and say, we're going to do something different. Same thing on the economic front or on our community front. We look at our different communities and say, well, we're not investing in those communities, but the people who are overseeing that are people that we know, are people who we think are nice, are people who we have dinner with or like to hang out with, but we have to be willing to have this critical and constructive dialogue and challenge each other. And so many times, I had somebody recently who came in from out of town. They were coming from kind of the East Coast, and somebody was in an offhanded conversation saying, you know, Cardell, don't say something so aggressive or something like that. And they were like, oh, you seem like the nicest person I know, Cardell. Like, why would people think you're aggressive? I mean, you're not from Memphis, so or in Memphis, and the fact of asking a question many times, people take as an affront. People get defensive. And so we have to be willing and open to have these dialogues and say, hey, we are African American businesses, total receipts are less than 1%. There is an impact that people that we know have on that fact, both in government and in private and public businesses. And what are we going to do about that? We have a challenge of funding our schools. And it's hard to just say, we should invest more money in our schools, but we shouldn't raise taxes or fees or any of these other things that we're going to do to bring in revenue. Like, we have to decide what are the priorities, what are the things that we want. Do we want a just city? Do we want a place where there is equitable opportunity and ability for people to achieve? And if we want that, then we have to be able to be willing and able to name that and claim that, and ask more from our leaders of what are the plans, what are the things that you plan on doing to get us there specifically, and holding them accountable in the elections that we have.
So, barriers to that hope that you have being achieved?
Barriers. I think a key barrier is a lack of courage to do the things that you guys are talking about. Marty, when you're talking about the intimacy of that encounter, of getting close to the problem, whatever slice of justice we want to go to work on, we're not going to be able to impact it from a long way away. We're going to have to get close. And because we're in a big, small town, we have to do that. Let's take racial disparities. The racial disparities are stark, and they cross every system that we're talking about. Certainly the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And the Department of Justice will tell you that they expect to find the same disparities that they found in Memphis in other urban cities across the country. But those same seemingly intractable disparities are right on the face of our public health systems. They're certainly embedded in our educational systems. They are embedded in any system you want to look at here. So most of us think that's unfair and that that's unjust. We're not going to be able to do anything about it unless we can get close, get proximate to the problem. I want to turn the lens just a bit on justice. I've been in this work and in this business for a long time, and I have yet to meet anyone who's not for justice. So why do we still have so much injustice? Why do we still have so much unfairness that's embedded in our systems? So I would like to go back to Bryan Stevenson and flip this a little bit. And what he says about people who are really concerned about justice is that you have to have the courage that when you encounter injustice, to get close enough to it, to bore down into it, because at the heart of just about every injustice is an abuse of power. And as happy-go-skippy as I was a few minutes ago, I think we are at a time in our history to where the important conversations about abuse of power are happening in our houses, our cars, in our workplace, in our political process. At the heart of just about every piece of bigotry is an abuse of power. And I think the big obstacle right now in this community is a lack of courage among those who are in places of leadership. And the only way they're going to go there is if we as a community push them.
So you all, on a daily basis, are doing things that are moving Memphis in what I would say is a positive direction. Okay? Maybe we're not to your headlines yet, but I think your work and all three of you are working in a way that is pushing in that direction. And so I'd like to sort of shift a little bit and say, as you're doing that work, a couple questions, and you can sort of answer as you like. Is there an example of something you could point to as an obvious success, something that shows that the work is having an impact, and then, for those of us who aren't doing that every single day, who that's not our profession, what are the kinds of things that we ought to do to not be an impediment, to do our share, to get towards the goals that we profess to have for our community? So, whoever, an example of success or a way that we can be involved.
Actually, I want to piggyback on what you said about the abuse of power. I think that so often people feel like they want to do something and they don't feel empowered. They feel like they don't know what to do to make a difference. And that can be very demoralizing and deflating, and nothing gets done. And so when I think about a success story, I would think about how, our work is with youth, so to just talk about how we're helping prepare them to be 21st century citizens who are empathetic as well as successful in college and career, and civically engaged and making a difference in their community. And if we can do that, if we can empower as many as young people as we can and give them a pathway where they know they can make a difference, then we will reach that tipping point that we need to get on this side of justice. We had some students who were in a facing history class at Overton High School who were studying the color line in the early 20th century. And so the assignment was go out and investigate what would happen if an African American were to cross the color line during this early 1900s period. What would happen to them? So they went off to do their research, and some of them were in the Memphis room at the library, and they discovered the lynching of a gentleman named L. Persons in 1917. And some of you may be familiar with that, but they had never heard of this lynching, and it was horrific. It happened on the Wolf River, on a bridge, which is right by where the Summer Drive-In is now. And this man was accused of murdering a white teenage girl. Obviously, there was no evidence, and he was abducted by a mob. And this lynching was planned, so it was advertised in the local newspaper. Central High School allowed students to go attend it. There were vendors who sold popcorn, and they estimate that about 5,000 people attended this lynching off of Summer Avenue in 1917. And so not only were the students outraged that this happened, but instead of just becoming cynical and thinking, well, it's just never gonna, nothing's ever gonna change, they said, people must know about this. We need to reconcile. We need to raise money so that there's a plaque on Summer Avenue so people know what happened. And so the lesson for that day sort of got thrown out, and they kept working on this, and they've started an organization called Students Uniting Memphis. They have appeared before the county commission to raise money. They have connected with another organization that actually started recently called the Lynching Sites Project, which is dedicated to reconciling with this history and bringing this history to light. It's a group of adults, and so that they met with the students and they said, you know what, we don't need to take the lead on this. Let's let the students do it. So the students are really taking charge of making sure that not only is there a memorial plaque letting people know what happened, but they are helping educate. They make presentations all around the community. So not only are they doing something of great good for our community, they connected with Central High School, and when the students and teachers there learned of their school's role, they were horrified, and so now plan to be involved. So this is ripple effect. They've got more and more students and people involved. They're empowered. I mean, they're not just making a difference in this one instance. They're seeing that they have a voice and people are listening to them, and they're leading the way. So I think that would be something. Oh, and then the other thing that's really interesting, I know that with this story about persons was afterwards, there were people that tried to address this injustice, and it led to the establishment of the NAACP here in Memphis.
Successes, right? Has anyone heard of this new nonprofit in the city called Just City? I have to give a plug for these guys. This is a group of talented, young, sophisticated professionals, lawyers, and others who are advancing this cause to try to make Memphis an ever more just city through advocacy, through reform, through service. And they are driving this narrative that I think is doing important work. One example of the important work has to do with their work around expungements. I was reading in the Commercial Appeal last week that the Clean Slate Fund had gone broke. You know what expungement is? I'll tell you what it is. People have been getting in trouble for a long time, right? This is not new. People have been getting in trouble with the justice system for eons, but until about 30 years ago, when you got in trouble, you got your lawyer, you got convicted, you did your time, you paid your penalty, whatever, and then you grew up and you went on with your life. And you did what everyone does. You formed a family, you raised your children, you educated them, you got old, and you died, and you watched that cycle perpetuate. What happens now is any brush with the justice system in the modern era, because the internet is a permanent imprint, and there are now lifetime consequences that attach even to the most innocuous of misdemeanor offenses. And what the Clean Slate Fund and this idea of expungement has done is to open the door to the possibility that a first or a second offender in the right circumstances can clean their record and go on. These lifetime consequences, one misdemeanor conviction for a kid growing up in Memphis can reduce their future earning capacity by 40%. A felony click reduces it by 60%. These things are important and they're real. Most folks grow out of this type of behavior. Most folks go on to live successful lives. And what this means, not just to that individual and to their families and their children, but also means to the future economic viability of this community. If we're going to be serious about workforce development, we have to find a way to reverse what we've done with our criminal justice system over the last several decades. And my hat's off to Just City and what these guys are doing. So if you feel compelled to do something, find out about this group, follow them, write them a check.
I would list, I guess, a few organizations. One on the education side, just coming from last night, we had Stand for Children. We had one of our strategy team meetings with our parent leaders, and they inspire me, and I see the successes in the work that we're able to do with them, and turning out to not just be advocates at their school, but to be willing to turn out and be advocates at the school board, at the county commission. I mean, I see the success of getting behind the district and focusing and fighting and being able to get an additional $28 million or so going to education funding that didn't come with the tax increase, but came with moving some money and having the sheer will and the priorities set, and having courageous leaders who fought to keep it that way. So that's one of the successes I see kind of on the education side. On the diversity and representation side, I think also in the education sector, one of the things that I've seen is a lot of our organizations, especially in the education reform side of things, are represented well in terms of African American leadership. If we look at, I just ran some data recently, about our charter school sector in Memphis, and for those schools that are authorized under Shelby County, 70% of them are African American, primarily African American founded. That's 68% of enrollment in those charter schools, and many of them are doing a greater amount of business with minority women-owned businesses than even the district is or any of the other governmental offices are doing. I see that as kind of a leadership, and as we think about the equaling out of access to funding and dollars, that is something where you see that 70% of that is about $90 million that's going into the education of kids, where you have people who are committed to the communities. I see Bruce Land out there, who is one of the founding board members and serves on the board now with me at Freedom Preparatory Academy, and giving time and energy and resources to support the work that they're doing in Westwood to increase the college attainment rate, not just for the kids who attend the school, but really looking at it from a community basis. So I see in that sector like an opening and an idea of what we should be seeing in the other places. In a lot of places, so many times when I see like the boosterism that we see, and we look at the projects that are successful or cool or innovative, I see them and I appreciate them, but then there's a piece of me that is hurt by them because they aren't representative. They aren't diverse. There aren't African Americans being involved in that work in an intentional way. So I see this sector as being able to show, and here is how you charge ahead, and here is where African Americans can show their ability, expertise, knowledge, and ability to lead. And then I think that that's reflected too in organizations I've been involved with, Hattie Lou Theater. And I think that Hattie Lou has shown the ability, through the sheer will and force of nature that is Ekundayo Mandela, the founder of the organization, the ability to build up from a ground level one of the hardiest and hardiest in terms of staying power, being around, and being able to get the full investment for the community to be able to go in 10 years to building a building, and then not just building a building and having it paid off at the building, but now expanding on that building and showing that you can create a diverse place, and that really is what shows the diversity of what brings Overton Square together, right? Like, as we think of it as a theater district, the thing that makes that Memphis is having Hattie Lou there and sitting there as part of this theater district that shows what we want to be and where we can be, and how that grows and expands our community in ways that we don't necessarily think about at the time.
Professor Kilson, you're already a part of our congregational family, but we want to make all three of you honorary. Thank you for being here today. My question is for Stephen Bush. This is a day for starting over, for forgiveness, for reconciliation. It's our holiest day of the year for that reason. And we had members of our big synagogue who made mistakes and who are caught in this expungement issue. Aside from writing a check and knowing that Daniel is the silent chair of Just City, who can our members call who did their time and want to start over and are facing that 60%, 40% within our Temple Israel family? Who should they call for this? Do they go on the website and just call Dan? So that part of it, we talk to middle and upper income people about giving money, but it's not the other. It's some of us in our own community. Who do they call?
The experts on navigating this right now are Just City, and they have very limited resources, so don't everyone call them all at once. One of the problems with the law that was passed a couple of years ago that created for the first time ever the opportunity for expungement is that it's drawn very narrowly. And the sad reality is most of you would not be eligible to take advantage of it. Most of you would not have your slate cleaned. So the real work is going back to the General Assembly to begin to broaden who is eligible for expungement and to begin to reduce the costs. It costs $450 to get yourself expunged, and most of the folks who really need it can't afford it. That's absurd. Okay? So you can call me if you want to, and I will talk to you. Or you can call Just City. Mayor Strickland's office raised a lot of money to do expungements, and so you can reach out there. The problem, though, is that right now the opportunity for expungement is still too narrow. Very few people will qualify.
You can call 211, and we not only have all of y'all in there, but we also have a list of places, they don't work specifically with people that have criminal backgrounds, but they work, including Gwen, actually, right now. The city of Memphis hires people with criminal backgrounds, the county hires people with criminal backgrounds. So there's, and there's other job finding assistance and they can click on and at least get that kind of.
There are all sorts of those resources out there.
Quick follow-up, you just answered, members who come to me and said, I told them about the expungement, they said, I don't qualify.
Right.
And I didn't understand, you just explained why, so we need to, how would we do?
So call Mark Norris. This is an important issue, and it's important for the economic reasons, it's important for all sorts of reasons, but this may be the most important reason. For someone who works hard to become eligible for it, and who really deserves it, the real benefit is the hope that springs from getting that fresh start. We talk a lot about systems, we talk a lot about trauma, we talk a lot about poverty, but people are resilient so long as they have some hope and it can churn. And I think that's a byproduct of a lot of the work that's underway in this community. It's certainly embedded in Facing History. It's certainly embedded in everything that's going on within the schools. And you may not know that, the best I can tell, the public defender was excused from juvenile court about 1978. But as a result of the Department of Justice litigation, we've gone back in to build a highly specialized law firm to represent kids. It's first and foremost to make sure all kids are treated fairly in that process, but also to do it in a way that promotes the development of a justice system that does its work, its important work, in a way that doesn't cause further harm. And in doing that, what we've discovered is that kids don't mind being held accountable. They don't mind being punished. What they hate is the feeling of being treated unfairly, of being done to. And so the role of defense counsel in this, there's all sorts of cool training about what we now know about adolescent brain development, how to respond to the needs of kids that have grown up in trauma and toxic stress, and all of this emerging neuroscience that's informing everything from the adverse childhood experiences work all the way forward. But don't underestimate the resilience of those kids, because if we advocate for them on behalf of their stated interests, they feel like they are a full part of this. And after they've been punished and made their way through the consequences, if they can merge with their identity intact, their hope intact, then that makes for a more just city.
So I just want briefly to push y'all on the question of what can someone write a check, call your state senator, learn, be open. What other either tangible or day-to-day kinds of things can people do short of becoming a public defender or the head of stand for children or a basic history teacher?
I have something very practical, and then I have something at the 50,000 foot level. Can I do them both? Those of you who are involved in hiring people, make yourself interview and hire people who have a criminal history. Hiring folks is always a little bit of a crapshoot, right? But if you hire someone with a criminal record, I will guarantee you that chances are it's going to be more likely to work out, and they will become one of the most entrusted employees you've ever had. There's research on this. It's moving. At the 50,000 foot level, and I think this is important because I think key to justice in this community is safety. Being safe, feeling safe. But we're constantly on the top 10 list of the most unsafe cities in the community. That's not in my neighborhood, but it's not far from my neighborhood. I think it's important that we separate the very important function of law enforcement, arrest, prosecution, defense, conviction, punishment. That's a very important piece of work. It is not the same thing as making us safe. I'm at risk of upsetting people connected to Operation Safe Community. I'm on the board. I don't mean to do that. But law enforcement and punishment is different from making us safe. And if we're going to live in a safe community, a more just community, then we have to get real about solving poverty.
Great. I think we've talked about a lot of those things. I think that there is something that you can do, and so these problems, these issues can seem intractable, and I think it's narrowing it down and saying, what's the one thing I can do? And maybe it's giving money. That's easy to do. I can write a check. Maybe it's going and volunteering. Maybe it's doing these things, but identifying what that one thing is. And then I'd also say, kind of pulling back to what we talked about earlier, it's one, being intentional. So looking at things with an intentional eye of what